Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook vault. The person who speaks most in the meeting is not the most powerful person in the room. They are the most anxious. Real power sits in calculated silence and speaks exactly once, and that single intervention lands with the weight of everything that was not said before it. This truth alone is sufficient to redraw the map of every professional relationship you have built up to this moment, because you have been reading the room through the wrong instrument entirely. You were measuring volume when you should have been measuring stillness. You were tracking words when you should have been tracking positioning. And while you were doing that, someone else in that room was doing something entirely different. If you require the approval of others before you commit to a decision, you have not built an identity. You have built a chronic dependency that feeds on the validation of people who are themselves running on borrowed confidence. The person in your environment whom you have labeled as self-assured, the one whose presence seems to require no external confirmation, that person does not possess confidence in the conventional sense. They possess trained indifference, engineered through repetition and deliberate exposure to discomfort, until the approval of the crowd became structurally irrelevant to their operational output. The difference between genuine confidence and trained indifference does not surface in ordinary moments. It surfaces under pressure, in the seconds when everything is being evaluated and the response either holds or collapses. And you will know which one you have built by what comes out of you in those seconds. There is a single sentence deployable at the opening of any negotiation that causes the opposing party to experience the sensation of control while you are the one directing every variable from behind an invisible partition. This is not manipulation in the theatrical sense. It is linguistic architecture built on a precise understanding of how the human brain processes decision-making under the specific cognitive load that negotiations generate. The book you are about to absorb does not appear in MBA curricula for one reason only. It explains how the game operates from the inside, in language that was never engineered for general consumption, because general consumption was never its intended destination. This content is not for those seeking morning motivation that evaporates before noon. It is for those who have made a final, non-negotiable decision to understand how social dominance is constructed scientifically and systematically, removed entirely from empty slogans and pre-packaged advice that was designed to keep you purchasing the next volume rather than implementing the current one. If you are comfortable in your life right now and feel no internal friction when you assess where you are against where you intended to be, close this. But if you sense that there is another tier, a tier that a few can see and fewer still actually inhabit, then continue. What follows was built for you specifically. In every day you pass without understanding these mechanisms, there is another person who understands them and is running them on you in complete silence. This is not theoretical. This is not rhetorical amplification. This is the operational reality inside every boardroom, every negotiation table, every relationship that one party believes is balanced while the other party has already decided the outcome. The money you did not earn this month did not vanish. It migrated to someone who knows one rule you do not yet know, and it will continue migrating there for as long as that gap remains open. The gap is not about intelligence. It is not about effort. It is about structural knowledge of how power forms, who holds it, how it moves, and how to position yourself at the point of its accumulation before anyone else in the room recognizes that accumulation is occurring. Power is not a personality trait. This is the first and most important demolition this text will perform on your current operating framework. You have been conditioned through years of cultural messaging, cinematic archetypes, and the simplified biographies of dominant figures to associate power with a specific physical and psychological profile: the loud voice, the commanding presence, the magnetic charisma that fills a room upon entry. That profile is not power. That profile is the performance of power for audiences that cannot distinguish between the two. Real power operates below the threshold of performance. It is structural, positional, and almost entirely invisible to those who have not been trained to detect its geometry. When a group of people assembles, whether in a corporate meeting, a social gathering, a family system, or a political coalition, something begins happening within the first minutes that most participants are entirely unaware of. Status hierarchies begin forming, information asymmetries begin consolidating, informal authority begins attaching itself to specific nodes within the network, not necessarily to the most vocal or most visibly confident individuals, but to those who have, consciously or unconsciously, occupied the structural positions that power naturally flows toward. Understanding which positions those are and how to move into them before the hierarchy solidifies is the foundational skill this book will install. The mechanisms through which power forms in groups are not random. They follow patterns that are consistent across cultures, organizational types, and historical periods, because they are rooted not in social convention but in the deep architecture of human cognitive and social processing. These patterns were operating in tribal councils 10,000 years ago. They operate in Fortune 500 boardrooms today. They operate in the informal hierarchies of friend groups, in the dynamics of romantic partnerships, in the invisible power structures of online communities that their own members believe are flat and leaderless. No human aggregation is flat. No human aggregation is leaderless. What varies is only whether the leadership is visible or whether it has learned to be invisible, and the invisible kind is always the more durable kind. The sovereign operator, the individual who has mastered the architecture of power in groups, does not enter a room and attempt to seize control. Attempting to seize control is a signal of insecurity that trained observers detect immediately and that causes the power structure to calcify against the person attempting the seizure. The sovereign operator enters a room and reads it. They identify where the actual decision-making authority resides, which is frequently not where the organizational chart says it resides. They identify the information flows, who knows what, who controls access to which knowledge, and where the bottlenecks are. They identify the emotional architecture of the group, who needs validation, who is operating from fear, who has unresolved status conflicts with whom, and then they position themselves quietly at the intersection of maximum leverage before anyone else has finished their first cup of coffee. This is what you are here to learn, not tactics, not scripts, not a list of power moves to deploy in sequence like a social algorithm. You are here to develop the perceptual infrastructure that makes all of those things unnecessary, because once you can see the geometry of power in any group you enter, the correct moves reveal themselves without a manual. Every group has a power structure. The only variable is whether that structure is legible to you or not. And the reason most people cannot read power structures accurately is not that they lack intelligence, it is that they were never given the correct lens. They were given a lens that was calibrated for visibility, for the surface signals that power occasionally emits when it wants to be seen, and they mistook those signals for power itself. What they were actually seeing was the exhaust, not the engine. The engine runs somewhere else entirely, and locating it is the first practical skill this text will develop in you. Consider what happens in the first 10 minutes of any new group formation. People arrive, they assess, they position. This happens at a speed that conscious thought cannot track because it is being executed by cognitive systems that predate language by hundreds of thousands of years. Within those first 10 minutes, provisional hierarchies have already begun to form. Certain individuals have already been assigned higher status by the collective unconscious processing of the group, not because of anything they said, not because of any formal designation, but because of signals that operate below the threshold of conscious perception, the way they occupy space, the timing of their movements, the direction of their gaze, and more importantly, where their gaze does not go, the micro-expressions that cross their face, or more precisely, the Micro-expressions that do not cross their face when they would cross the face of someone with less structural confidence. These signals are being read and processed by every person in that room simultaneously, and the output of that processing is a provisional map of who matters, who defers to whom, and where the actual gravity of the group is located. Most people are not aware they are generating this map. Most people are not aware anyone else is generating it. But the sovereign operator is aware of both facts, and that awareness is the entire advantage. Status signals operate in clusters. No single signal is determinative. A person who speaks rarely but with precision will accumulate status. A person who speaks rarely but with visible nervousness will lose status. The variable is not the behavior itself, but the internal state the behavior reveals, because groups are extraordinarily sensitive to the detection of authentic internal states, far more sensitive than any individual within the group consciously believes themselves to be. You cannot fake the signals of high internal status for extended periods because the cognitive load of the performance eventually introduces micro-inconsistencies that the group's collective processing detects and registers, even if no individual member can articulate what they detected. They will simply begin to feel, without knowing why, that something about the person is not quite right. That feeling is social intelligence operating correctly. This means that the path to genuine structural power within any group is not primarily behavioral. It is not a matter of learning which postures to adopt or which phrases to deploy. Those things are downstream consequences of something more fundamental. The path to structural power begins with the internal architecture, with the actual recalibration of how you process status, threat, and uncertainty at the level where those processes happen before behavior is generated. A person who has genuinely resolved their relationship with status threat, who does not experience the involuntary physiological cascade that status challenges trigger in most people, will emit the correct signals automatically, without performance, without maintenance, and without the cognitive overhead that performance requires. The question then becomes, what creates that internal architecture, and can it be built deliberately? The answer to the second part of that question is yes, with conditions. It can be built deliberately, but not through the methods that the self-development industry has been selling for the past 4 decades. Affirmations do not build it. Visualization does not build it. Motivational frameworks do not build it. What builds it is a specific kind of repeated exposure combined with a specific kind of cognitive reframing, applied at the precise moments when the status threat response is active, not in the calm of a morning routine when the threat is absent and the reframing costs nothing. Power in groups also has a topography. It is not distributed evenly, and it does not attach itself randomly to individuals. It accumulates at specific structural positions within the network of relationships that any group generates. The person who controls information flow holds more power than the person who controls formal authority in almost every organizational context, because information is the actual currency of decision-making, and formal authority can only exercise itself with the information it receives. Control what information reaches the decision maker, control how that information is framed when it arrives, and you control the decision, regardless of whether your name appears on any organizational chart or carries any formal title. This structural understanding of power is what separates the sovereign operator from the ambitious individual who has not yet developed the correct map. The ambitious individual targets visible positions. They want the title, the office, the public designation of authority, because they have been conditioned to equate those things with power. The sovereign operator targets structural positions. They ask not who has the title, but who has the information, who controls access, who sits at the intersection of the most consequential relationships within the network. Those positions are frequently held by people with modest titles and quiet presences, and they are almost always the most durable power positions in any organization because they survive leadership changes, restructurings, and the political cycles that erode formal authority with regularity. You are beginning to see the geometry. You are beginning to understand that what you were taught to look for and what actually matters are not the same thing. The distance between those two maps is the distance between where you are and where the sovereign operators already reside. Closing that distance does not require more effort applied to the old map. It requires a complete replacement of the map itself, executed with precision and without sentimentality for the frameworks you were handed before you knew enough to question them. The map replacement process is not comfortable. This needs to be stated directly and without the softening language that most developmental frameworks insert at this point to manage the reader's anxiety and keep them engaged through reassurance. Reassurance is not what this text offers. What this text offers is accuracy, and the accurate statement is this: dismantling a cognitive map that you have been operating on for years, one that has been reinforced by every institutional structure you have moved through, every authority figure who shaped your early understanding of how the world works, and every success you achieved within the old framework. That dismantling process produces genuine disorientation. It is supposed to. The disorientation is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is the disorientation. Precise neurological signature of a map being replaced, and confusing it for failure is the single most common reason people abort the process at the exact moment it is beginning to work. The first component of the new map is a reclassification of what power actually is at its functional level. Power, operationally defined, is the capacity to shape the decision space of others without triggering their resistance mechanisms. Every word in that definition carries weight. The capacity to shape, not the capacity to force. Forcing decisions is the lowest form of power and the most costly because it requires constant energy expenditure and generates resistance that compounds over time. Shaping decision space is categorically different. It means altering the options that another person perceives as available, the information they have access to when forming their judgment, the emotional state they are in when the decision point arrives, and the social context that makes certain choices feel natural and others feel costly. When you operate at that level, the person making the decision believes they are exercising free choice, and in a technical sense they are, within a space that you have already engineered. This is not a moral argument. The observation that power operates this way is descriptive, not prescriptive. Every parent who has ever structured a choice for a child between two acceptable options, rather than asking an open question, has used this mechanism. Every architect who has ever designed a space that directs human movement without signs or barriers has used this mechanism. Every communicator who has ever framed a proposal in terms of what will be lost by not adopting it rather than what will be gained by adopting it has used this mechanism. The question is not whether you will use these mechanisms. You already do, unconsciously and inefficiently. The question is whether you will understand them well enough to use them with precision and intentionality. The second component of the new map is an accurate model of how resistance is generated and how it can be prevented from forming in the first place. Resistance is not a rational phenomenon. It presents itself as rational, it dresses itself in logical objections and principled disagreements, but its actual origin is almost always emotional and almost always traceable to one of three sources. The first source is status threat. The person senses, consciously or not, that accepting your influence diminishes their position in the hierarchy. The The second source is autonomy threat. The person senses that their freedom of choice is being constrained, and the sensation of constraint triggers a reflexive push in the opposite direction, regardless of whether the constraint choice was one they would have made anyway. The third source is identity threat. The person senses that the position you are advancing conflicts with a belief that is load-bearing in their self-concept, and updating that belief would require a revision of identity that the psychological immune system will resist with considerable force. Understanding which of these three sources is generating resistance in any specific interaction is the diagnostic skill that separates effective influence from the kind of blunt persuasion that creates compliance without commitment and agreement without action. Blunt persuasion wins the argument and loses the outcome. It produces a person who has said yes in the room and is constructing the sabotage before they reach the door. The sovereign operator is not interested in winning arguments. They are interested in engineering outcomes, and those two objectives frequently require entirely different approaches. The third component of the new map is a precise understanding of information asymmetry as a power resource. Information asymmetry exists in every human interaction. No two people ever enter a conversation with identical knowledge, identical context, or identical understanding of what is actually at stake. The question is always, who is aware of the asymmetry and who is not, and who is managing it deliberately, and who is leaking their position without knowing it. Most people leak their position continuously. They signal what they know and do not know, what they want and fear not getting, what their alternatives are, and how attractive those alternatives actually are. They signal all of this not primarily through what they say, but through what they ask, how quickly they respond, what they react to, and the emotional register of their reactions. The sovereign operator runs the information asymmetry in both directions simultaneously. They manage what they reveal about their own position with the same precision they apply to gathering intelligence about the other party's position. They understand that every question is a disclosure as much as it is a request. They understand that silence, deployed correctly, causes the other party to fill the vacuum with information they had no intention of providing. They understand that the negotiator who speaks first after a significant offer has been made is almost always the one who is more uncomfortable with the silence, and that discomfort is a precise readout of relative need, which is the most important variable in any negotiation. These three components, the redefinition of power as decision space engineering, the accurate diagnosis of resistance sources, and the deliberate management of information asymmetry, form the foundational architecture of the sovereign operator's perceptual toolkit. They are not advanced techniques to be layered on top of existing frameworks. They are the replacement for those frameworks, installed at the level where perception happens, before strategy is formed, before behavior is generated, before words are chosen. At that level, everything downstream changes automatically. Established hierarchies are a different terrain from forming ones, and the mistake most people make when they enter an existing power structure is that they attempt to apply the same logic that would work in a formation context. In a forming group, positioning is fluid, the hierarchy is being written in real time, and a sufficiently sophisticated operator can influence how that hierarchy forms by occupying the correct structural positions early. In an established group, the hierarchy has already been written. The positions have owners. The alliances have histories. The informal rules about who defers to whom, who speaks when, and who has access to what have been operating long enough to feel like natural law to the people inside the system. Attempting to challenge that structure directly is not just ineffective, it is actively counterproductive, because established hierarchies have immune systems, and those immune systems respond to direct challenges with a consolidation of the existing order that leaves the challenger in a worse position than before they attempted the move. The correct approach to an established hierarchy is not confrontation and not passive acceptance. It is infiltration through value creation.
Every established hierarchy, regardless of how stable it appears from the outside, contains stress points. These are the gaps between what the hierarchy officially produces and what the people within it actually need. The unresolved tensions between factions, the information flows that are blocked or distorted by the existing structure, the problems that everyone acknowledges privately and no one addresses publicly because addressing them would require someone to absorb a political cost that no current member of the hierarchy is willing to absorb. These stress points are not weaknesses to be exploited in the adversarial sense. They are opportunities to create value that the existing structure cannot create for itself. And the person who creates that value acquires structural power that is both genuine and difficult to remove because it is anchored in actual function rather than political positioning alone. This is how sovereign operators enter established systems. They do not arrive announcing their ambitions. They arrive with exceptional observational patience, spending the early period mapping the actual topology of the hierarchy, which frequently diverges significantly from its official representation. They identify the stress points. They identify which individuals hold informal power that exceeds their formal designation. They identify who the formal leaders actually depend on for information, execution, and social stability, because those dependencies are the real load-bearing structures of any organization, and the people at those dependency nodes hold more durable power than their titles suggest. Then, having mapped all of this, they position themselves to solve a problem that the hierarchy cannot solve for itself, in a way that creates genuine value for the people whose support will be necessary for any subsequent expansion of their own influence.
The sequence matters enormously. Most people who attempt to build power within established systems reverse the sequence. They seek influence before they have created sufficient value to justify it, and the hierarchy reads that reversal accurately and resists it. The perception that someone is seeking power for its own sake, rather than as a byproduct of genuine contribution, triggers the hierarchy's immune response immediately, because every established power holder understands, at some level, that influence acquired without a functional anchor is influence that can be redirected against them. They will not consciously articulate this threat assessment, but they will act on it through the gradual withdrawal of access, the subtle exclusion from consequential conversations, and the quiet signaling to other members of the hierarchy that this person's ambitions should be monitored. The sovereign operator avoids triggering this response not through concealment of their capabilities, but through the correct sequencing of their actions. Demonstrate value first. Acquire functional indispensability in a domain that matters to the people who hold existing power. Let the influence accumulate as a natural consequence of that indispensability, rather than as a goal being pursued in parallel with the value creation. This sequencing does not require the suppression of ambition. It requires the redirection of ambitious energy from the visible pursuit of status toward the invisible accumulation of structural leverage. And it produces outcomes that are far more durable than anything that direct status seeking generates. Coalition architecture is the next dimension of power in established groups. No individual, regardless of their personal capabilities or structural position, holds power in isolation. Power in groups is always relational, always dependent on the network of obligations, alliances, and mutual dependencies that connect individual nodes. The sovereign operator understands that their personal power at any given moment is not simply a function of their individual attributes. It is a function of the quality and strategic positioning of their relational network within the group's overall topology. Two people with identical individual capabilities will have dramatically different power profiles if one has invested in coalition architecture and the other has not. Coalition building is frequently misunderstood as a political activity, in the pejorative sense, as the cultivation of allies for factional purposes. This misunderstanding causes many capable people to avoid it on principle, believing that their work should speak for itself and that the cultivation of relationships for strategic purposes is somehow beneath them or incompatible with their integrity.
This belief is expensive. It leaves capability unanchored, floating in an organizational space where it cannot generate its full potential impact, because impact in complex human systems is never solely a function of individual capability. It is always also a function of how that capability is connected to the people and resources it needs to express itself fully.
Effective coalition architecture is not transactional in the crude sense of favors exchanged for favors. It is the deliberate cultivation of relationships in which genuine mutual value exists, where each party in the coalition holds something the other needs, and where that mutual dependency creates a stability that purely transactional alliances never achieve. Purely transactional alliances dissolve the moment the transaction no longer favors both parties. Genuine mutual value alliances survive adversity, survive the political cycles that restructure organizations, and survive the inevitable periods when one party needs to draw on the relationship without having an immediate equivalent to offer in return. Genuine alliances are built on a principle that most people intellectually understand but operationally violate with remarkable consistency: the principle that value must be given before it is requested, not as a performance of generosity, not as a calculated investment with an expected return timeline, but as a genuine orientation toward the question of what this person needs that I am in a position to provide, executed without the attachment to reciprocation that transforms a gift into a loan. The paradox is that this detachment from reciprocation is precisely what generates it. When people receive value without an implicit invoice attached, when the giving does not carry the subtle pressure of an expected return, the psychological response is not exploitation of the giver's apparent naivety. It is a profound sense of obligation that is far more durable and far more likely to generate genuine loyalty than any transactional exchange could produce. This is not idealism dressed in strategic language. It is an accurate description of how human social bonding actually operates at the neurological level. Reciprocity is one of the most deeply wired social impulses in the human cognitive architecture. When it is triggered by genuine value given without visible strings, it produces a felt obligation that the recipient experiences as a personal moral commitment rather than a contractual one. Contractual obligations are discharged when the contract terms are met. Moral commitments do not have discharge conditions. They persist, they compound over time, and they activate most reliably in exactly the high-stakes moments when you most need your coalition to hold. The selection of coalition partners is as important as the method of coalition building. Not every relationship within an organization merits the investment of genuine alliance construction. The sovereign operator is selective, and that selectivity is based not on the current formal status of potential partners, but on an assessment of their trajectory, their actual capabilities relative to their current positioning, their integrity under pressure, and the structural positions they occupy or are likely to occupy as the organization evolves. A relationship with someone who is currently junior but occupies a critical information node, who demonstrates genuine capability that exceeds their formal recognition, and who has shown under pressure that their commitments hold, is worth far more investment than a relationship with someone whose current title is impressive, but whose positional power is dependent on a specific leadership configuration that may not survive the next organizational cycle. The sovereign operator thinks in trajectories, not snapshots. They are building a network that will be valuable 3 years from now, not just one that is impressive at the current moment. This temporal dimension of coalition architecture is what separates it from simple networking, which is primarily snapshot-oriented, focused on the current status and current utility of contacts, rather than the directional momentum of relationships over time. Within established hierarchies, there's also the question of how to manage relationships with existing power holders, the people who currently occupy the positions that define the hierarchy's formal structure.
This is where many capable operators make their most costly mistakes, either by over-investing in these relationships at the expense of building the broader coalition that would give their position genuine structural depth, or by neglecting them entirely in the belief that formal authority is irrelevant to actual power, which is true in the long run, but dangerously incomplete as a short-run operating principle. Existing power holders must be managed with a specific combination of genuine respect for the functional authority they hold and complete internal independence from the need for their approval. The respect is operational. Formal authority, even when it does not reflect actual power accurately, controls access to resources, opportunities, and information that matter in the short term. Treating it with contempt is expensive, regardless of how sophisticated your understanding of its limitations. The internal independence is psychological and strategic. The moment you need the approval of an existing power holder in the way that approval operates, the moment their assessment of you begins to function as a referendum on your own value, you have handed them a lever that they will use, consciously or not, to constrain your development within the hierarchy. The correct internal posture toward existing power holders is one of collaborative utility. You are useful to them, they are useful to you. The relationship is functional and mutually valuable, and it does not require their personal affection or their public endorsement to operate effectively. This posture communicates something to them at the level of social signal that formal deference never communicates, that you are operating from a position of genuine security rather than hierarchical dependency. And that signal, paradoxically, generates more genuine respect from most power holders than performative deference does, because people who hold real power have seen enough performative deference to recognize it immediately, and they know that it reflects a person who is primarily oriented toward managing upward rather than creating genuine value.
There is a specific dynamic that emerges in established hierarchies when a new operator begins to accumulate structural power through the mechanisms described here. The existing power holders will notice, not necessarily consciously and not necessarily immediately, but the signals will register. The sovereign operator anticipates this moment and prepares for it not by concealing their growing influence, which is both impossible and unnecessary, but by ensuring that their accumulation of power has been visibly anchored in value creation that benefits the existing power holders as much as it benefits anyone else. When your growing influence is legible as something that makes the existing hierarchy more effective rather than as something that threatens to displace it, the immune response is dramatically attenuated. This does not mean that conflict is always avoidable. In some organizational contexts, the existing power structure is so calcified, so dependent on the maintenance of specific information asymmetries and the suppression of specific capabilities, that genuine value creation is itself a threat to the people whose power depends on things remaining as they are. In those contexts, the sovereign operator faces a genuine strategic choice between accommodation and disruption, and the correct choice depends entirely on a clear-eyed assessment of the costs and realistic outcomes of each path. The strategic choice between accommodation and disruption is one of the most consequential decisions an operator will face within any established hierarchy, and it is made badly far more often than it is made well, because it is almost always made under emotional conditions that distort the assessment. The person who has been building genuine value, who has been operating with patience and precision, who has been investing in coalition architecture and managing relationships with the care and deliberateness that serious power building requires, will at some point encounter a moment where the existing structure signals that their growth is unwelcome. That signal will carry an emotional charge. It will feel like a betrayal of an implicit contract, the contract that said competence and value creation would be rewarded with expanded influence and recognition.
The emotional response to that signal, whether it manifests as anger, as wounded pride, or as the anxious scramble to repair a relationship that has cooled, is the single greatest threat to clear strategic thinking at exactly the moment when clear strategic thinking is most required. The sovereign operator has prepared for this moment before it arrives. They have developed, in advance, a framework for assessing the accommodation versus disruption question that operates independently of their emotional state when the question becomes live. That framework begins with a single diagnostic. Is the resistance to my growth structural or personal? Structural resistance means that the existing power configuration genuinely cannot accommodate the expansion of your expansion.
Influence without losing something essential to its own stability. Personal resistance means that a specific individual within the hierarchy has developed a threat assessment of you that is driving their behavior, independent of any genuine structural incompatibility. These two forms of resistance require entirely different responses, and applying the response appropriate to one when you are actually facing the other is a guaranteed path to an outcome that serves neither your interests nor the organization's. Structural resistance requires a strategic reassessment of your position within that specific hierarchy. If the power structure genuinely cannot accommodate your growth without destabilizing itself, you are facing a ceiling that is architectural rather than personal, and the question becomes whether the value of remaining within that structure justifies the cost of operating beneath a ceiling that will not rise. This is not a question with a universal answer. It depends on the resources the hierarchy provides, the alternatives available outside it, the timeline of your objectives, and the realistic probability that the structural constraints will shift as the hierarchy itself evolves. What it does not depend on is the hope that the people whose interests are served by the ceiling will voluntarily raise it. They will not. Structural ceilings are not raised by the people they protect. They are raised by changes in the environment that make the cost of maintaining them higher than the cost of abandoning them. Personal resistance is more tractable, but requires a different kind of precision. When a specific individual within the hierarchy has developed a threat assessment of you, the worst response is to either ignore it or to attempt to address it through increased performance, the instinct to simply produce more value in the hope that the quality of your work will override the political dynamic. It will not. Political dynamics do not respond to performance data. They respond to changes in the social and emotional calculus of the person running them. The relevant question is not how to produce more value, but how to alter the threat assessment itself, which means understanding what is driving it. Is it a status threat, the perception that your growth diminishes their relative position? Is it an autonomy threat, the sense that your expanding influence reduces their control over their own domain? Is it an identity threat, the recognition that your approach or your results implicitly challenge a framework they have built their professional identity around? Each of these threat sources has a specific response architecture. Status threats are addressed through consistent, visible deference on the dimensions of status that matter most to the threatened individual, combined with the deliberate positioning of your own growth as something that elevates their status rather than competing with it. The framing is everything. Your success becomes evidence of their judgment, their mentorship, their organizational vision, regardless of whether any of those things were actually causally connected to your development. Autonomy threats are addressed through the explicit expansion of the threatened individual's decision-making authority in domains adjacent to your growing influence, creating a structure in which your expansion is experienced not as a contraction of their space, but as a differentiation that leaves their core domain intact and protected. Identity threats are the most complex and the most resistant to direct intervention because they require the threatened individual to update a self-concept, which the psychological immune system resists with a force proportional to how load-bearing that self-concept is.
the indirect approach, introducing information that creates cognitive dissonance with the threatened framework without attributing that introduction to any deliberate agenda, is almost always more effective than any direct confrontation with the identity-anchored belief. Beyond the accommodation versus disruption question, there is the matter of timing. Power moves made at the wrong moment in an organizational cycle are power moves that fail, regardless of their intrinsic quality. Every hierarchy has cycles, periods of stability and periods of flux, moments when the existing structure is most consolidated and moments when it is most permeable to reconfiguration. Organizational transitions, leadership changes, external pressures that strain the existing structure's capacity to respond, internal crises that expose the gap between the hierarchy's official capabilities and its actual ones. These are the moments when the topology of power is most fluid, when positions that appeared fixed become available, and when the structural leverage accumulated through patient coalition building and value creation can be converted into actual positional power with a speed and completeness that would be impossible during stable periods. The sovereign operator tracks these cycles with the same attention they give to their own positioning within the hierarchy. They are not waiting passively for a moment of opportunity. They are maintaining a state of continuous readiness, ensuring that when the organizational environment shifts into a configuration that makes reconfiguration possible, they are positioned to move immediately and decisively, with a coalition that is already built, a value proposition that is already demonstrated, and a map of the power topology that is already accurate. Readiness is not a state that arrives on its own. It is engineered, deliberately and systematically, across the periods of organizational stability that precede the moments of flux when it will be needed. Most people experience organizational stability as a period of consolidation, a time to maintain existing relationships, deliver consistent performance, and wait for the environment to create the conditions for advancement. This sovereign operator experiences organizational stability as the most valuable building period available, precisely because the absence of crisis means that the accumulation of structural leverage can proceed without the defensive reactions that high-stakes moments trigger in the people around them. When nothing urgent is happening, people are less vigilant. Information flows more freely. Relationships can be deepened without the political scrutiny that accompanies visible power moves during periods of organizational tension. The quiet periods are where the serious work gets done. The preparation for the moment of movement has three distinct components, each of which must be in place before the organizational environment shifts, because attempting to build any of them during the shift itself is like attempting to construct a foundation while the building is already being erected on top of it. The first component is positional clarity, a precise, current, and accurate understanding of where you stand within the power topology of your hierarchy at this specific moment, what structural leverage you hold, what coalition resources are available to you, what information asymmetries operate in your favor, and what vulnerabilities exist in your current position that could be exploited by others during a period of organizational flux. Most people significantly overestimate their positional strength during stable periods because the stability itself masks the vulnerabilities. The consolidation that stable periods produce is not the same as genuine structural security. It is a temporary equilibrium that the next period of organizational stress will test, and discovering the weaknesses in your position during that test rather than before it is an extremely expensive way to acquire the information. The second component is scenario mapping. Every organization has a finite set of plausible transition scenarios, configurations of future states that the existing power structure could evolve into, given the pressures and trajectories currently operating on it. The sovereign operator has mapped these scenarios in advance, not with the goal of predicting which one will materialize, which is rarely possible with useful precision, but with the goal of understanding what their optimal positioning would be in each scenario and what preparatory actions would improve their position across the widest range of plausible futures simultaneously. This is portfolio thinking applied to organizational positioning. Rather than optimizing for a single predicted future, build a position that is robust across multiple futures, so that when the actual transition arrives, the adaptation required is minimal regardless of which scenario materializes. The third component is the pre-positioning of coalition commitments. During periods of organizational flux, alliances form and dissolve with a speed that makes real-time coalition building nearly impossible. The relationships that will matter in the moment of transition are the ones that were built during the preceding stability, tested across smaller stakes and anchored in genuine mutual value before the high-stakes moment arrived. Pre-positioned coalition commitments do not need to be explicit. They do not require conversations in which both parties acknowledge that they are building a strategic alliance for future deployment. What they require is a
relationship with sufficient depth and genuine mutual investment that when the moment of organizational transition arrives and each party is assessing who they can rely on, the answer is already obvious, without negotiation. When the organizational environment finally shifts into a configuration that makes positional reconfiguration possible, the sovereign operator's approach to the actual movement of power is precise and economical. They do not attempt to capture everything simultaneously. Overreach during organizational transitions is one of the most common failure modes among capable operators who have done the preparatory work correctly but miscalibrate the execution. The temptation to maximize gain during a window of opportunity is understandable but dangerous, because every move made during organizational flux is visible to multiple parties simultaneously, and the appearance of aggressive opportunism, even when the underlying moves are entirely legitimate, triggers the defensive consolidation of the people who are not your allies, and may cause even your genuine allies to reassess the costs of their association with you. The economical approach to power movement means identifying the 2 or 3 positional changes that would deliver the greatest structural leverage, executing those changes with the minimum visible footprint, and allowing the downstream consequences of those positional changes to manifest over the subsequent stability period rather than attempting to realize all of them immediately. This patience in execution, after the extensive patience in preparation, is perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect of the sovereign operator's practice, because the moment of flux feels urgent, feels like a window that must be maximized before it closes, and that urgency is itself a cognitive distortion that must be recognized and managed rather than acted upon. The management of urgency as a cognitive distortion is, more broadly, one of the central disciplines of effective power operation. Urgency is frequently manufactured, either by the environment or by other parties within it who benefit from your making decisions under time pressure, rather than with the deliberateness that your actual strategic situation warrants. The sovereign operator has developed a reflexive suspicion of urgency that does not originate from their own assessment of the situation. When pressure to decide quickly comes from an external source, the first question is always who benefits from this decision being made now rather than after adequate deliberation, and that question frequently reveals an information asymmetry that the urgency was designed to prevent you from closing. This suspicion of manufactured urgency extends beyond organizational politics into every domain where power dynamics operate. In negotiation, artificially imposed deadlines are among the most common and most effective tools for extracting concessions from parties who have not developed the discipline to distinguish them between genuine constraints and manufactured ones.
In social hierarchies, the pressure to respond immediately to status challenges, to defend your position before you have had time to assess whether the challenge actually threatens anything worth defending, is a mechanism that serves the challenger's interests by forcing you to engage on their terms and their timeline. The sovereign operator declines that engagement. They respond on their own timeline, with their own framing, after their own assessment. And the deliberateness of that response is itself a signal of structural confidence that changes the dynamic more effectively than any specific content of the response could. The final architecture of sovereign operation, the internal structures that make all of this sustainable across years rather than deployable only in specific high-stakes moments, is what the next section addresses. Sustainability is the dimension of power operation that receives the least attention in the frameworks most people encounter, because the frameworks most people encounter were built to produce visible results in short timeframes, optimized for the attention span of an audience that measures progress in weeks rather than years. The sovereign operator thinks in years, not because they are patient in the passive sense of someone who waits without anxiety for outcomes to materialize, but because they understand that the most durable forms of structural power are built on foundations that require time to cure, and that attempting to accelerate that curing process by applying more pressure produces a structure that is impressive in the short term and fragile in the long term. The construction metaphor is exact. Concrete that is forced to bear load before it is fully cured will hold initially and fail catastrophically later, at a moment and under conditions that the builder did not choose and cannot control. The internal architecture that makes sovereign operation sustainable across years, rather than deployable only in isolated moments, is built on three foundations that are interdependent and must be developed simultaneously rather than sequentially. The first is what might be called metabolic independence, the capacity to operate at full cognitive and strategic effectiveness during extended periods of uncertainty, adversity, and the absence of external validation. Most people's operational capacity is significantly dependent on environmental conditions. They perform well when things are going well, when their efforts are being recognized, when the feedback from their environment is positive and the trajectory is visible. They perform poorly when the environment is ambiguous, when their efforts are producing no legible output, when the feedback is negative or absent. This dependency on environmental conditions is the most significant limiter of sustained high-level operation, because the environments in which the highest stakes power dynamics play out are almost never consistently positive, and almost never provide the clear, timely feedback that dependent operational systems require to maintain their function. Metabolic independence is built through deliberate exposure to extended periods of ambiguity, combined with the disciplined maintenance of operational standards during those periods. Not the performance of maintained standards for external observers, but the actual maintenance of the internal processes, the quality of thinking, the precision of observation, the consistency of coalition management, the accuracy of positional assessment during periods when no one is watching and no external reward is forthcoming. This is the training that separates the operator whose capabilities are genuine from the operator whose capabilities are context-dependent, and the separation becomes most visible and most consequential during exactly the extended periods of organizational stability and ambiguity that precede the moments of flux when positional reconfiguration becomes possible. The second foundation is what can be described as ethical architecture, a precise, examined, and internally consistent framework for determining which power moves are compatible with the operator's long-term interests and which are not, based not primarily on moral principle in the abstract, but on an accurate understanding of how trust, reputation, and the perception of integrity function as structural power resources over time. This reframing is not a cynical reduction of ethics to strategy. It is an accurate observation that in any system where repeated interactions occur among parties with memories, the short-term gains available through deception, exploitation, or the violation of implicit commitments are almost always outweighed by the long-term costs to the structural power resources that those behaviors erode. Trust, once destroyed, is rebuilt at an enormous cost and is never fully restored to its original load-bearing capacity. Reputation, once damaged by a visible violation of the implicit rules that govern power operation within a specific community, generates a resistance to future influence attempts that no individual interaction can overcome. The sovereign operator does not avoid ethical violations because they are morally squeamish. They avoid them because they are structurally expensive in ways that compound over time, and because the internal coherence of their ethical framework is itself a source of the cognitive clarity and decisiveness that effective power operation requires. A person who is uncertain about which commitments they will honor under pressure, who has not resolved in advance the question of where their lines are and why, is a person who will face that uncertainty at the worst possible moment, under conditions of stress and time pressure, and will make a decision that they cannot fully stand behind afterward. That internal incoherence is a structural vulnerability that sophisticated observers within any power system will detect and eventually exploit.
The third foundation is perceptual renewal, the continuous recalibration of the maps through which the operator reads their environment to prevent the hardening of accurate observations into rigid frameworks that stop updating when the environment changes. Every map that was accurate at one point in time will become less accurate as the environment it describes evolves. The hierarchy that was correctly mapped 6 months ago has shifted. The alliances that were correctly assessed have developed. The information asymmetries that were correctly identified have been partially closed or have opened in new directions. The sovereign operator who stops updating their maps, who begins operating on the confidence of previous accuracy rather than the discipline of continuous observation, is accumulating a gap between their model of the environment and the environment itself that will eventually produce a significant strategic error. Perceptual renewal requires the deliberate practice of intellectual humility about current maps, combined with the maintenance of the observational discipline that produced them in the first place. It means holding every current assessment with a degree of provisional confidence rather than certainty, remaining genuinely open to information that contradicts the current model, and building into regular practice the explicit question of what would have to be true for my current assessment of this situation to be wrong. That question, asked honestly and regularly, is the single most effective guard against the perceptual calcification that transforms accurate observers into obsolete ones. These three foundations, metabolic independence, ethical architecture, and perceptual renewal, are not the ceiling of sovereign operation. They are its floor. They are the minimum internal infrastructure required to sustain the external practices described throughout this text, across the timeframes in which the most significant power dynamics actually play out. Without them, everything else described here is a set of techniques that will work brilliantly in the short term and collapse under the weight of their own success in the long term, because success without internal infrastructure produces overextension, and overextension in power systems produces exactly the kind of catastrophic positional collapse that careful operators spend years constructing the conditions to avoid. The final section of this text draws everything together into a single integrated operational framework. The integrated operational framework is not a checklist. It is not a sequence of steps to be executed in order. It is a way of being present within power systems, a continuous orientation toward the environment that operates simultaneously across all of the dimensions described throughout this text, reading the topology of the environment. Hierarchies, while managing information asymmetries, while maintaining coalition relationships, while tracking organizational cycles, while sustaining the internal architecture that keeps all of it functioning without degradation over time. This simultaneity is what distinguishes the sovereign operator from the tactician. The tactician applies specific tools to specific problems as they arise. The sovereign operator maintains a state of continuous environmental engagement in which the tools are always active and always integrated, so that no individual situation requires a separate decision about which framework to apply. The framework is already running. The situation simply reveals which of its outputs are most relevant in this specific moment. The development of that integrated state is not achieved through the accumulation of more knowledge. You have enough knowledge. The frameworks described in this text are sufficient for the transformation they promise, not because they are exhaustive, but because they address the correct level of the system. Most knowledge that people accumulate about power, influence, and organizational dynamics addresses the surface level, the behaviors, the tactics, the specific moves that produce specific outcomes in specific contexts. That knowledge is useful but limited because surface-level interventions produce surface-level changes that do not persist when the context shifts. What this text has addressed throughout is the perceptual and cognitive level that underlies all of those surface behaviors, the level at which the correct observations become automatic, the correct assessments become reflexive, and the correct moves reveal themselves without deliberate calculation because the map from which they are being generated is accurate enough to make the route obvious. The transformation from tactician to sovereign operator is therefore not primarily an addition, it is primarily a subtraction. It is the removal of the perceptual filters, the status anxieties, the approval dependencies, the urgency responses, the cognitive shortcuts that were installed by environments that were optimizing for your compliance rather than your effectiveness. What remains after that removal is not a different person. It is a clearer version of the same person, operating with less interference between their actual perception of the environment and the actions that perception would naturally generate. The interference was never structural, it was installed, and what was installed can be uninstalled through the deliberate application of the frameworks described here, consistently across the extended timeframes that genuine structural change requires. The world does not change its power structures for individuals who have not demonstrated the capacity to understand and navigate them. It was not designed. The existing configurations of power in every system you inhabit were built by people who understood these dynamics, consciously or through the accumulated wisdom of counties. Extended experience, and they persist because they serve the interests of the people who hold them. Your development of the same understanding does not guarantee you a position within those configurations. Nothing guarantees that. What it gives you is the capacity to see the geometry clearly enough to make genuinely informed choices about where to position yourself, how to build what you need to build, and when to move. The outcome is not predetermined. The capacity to pursue it with full information and full strategic sophistication, rather than with the partial map and reactive positioning that most people bring to the highest stakes games of their professional and social lives, is what this text has been constructing from its first sentence to this one. You now hold the architecture. What you build with it is entirely your own.